Osiris.
We're mass communicating. Mass communicating.
Welcome back to Touchdowns All Day. I am your host, Max Dawson, presenting part 2 of the Touchdowns All Day miniseries, The Jernee Mill Road Back to Sayreville. In part 1, we spoke with Dan Berkowitz, founder and CEO of 100X Entertainment, and the man behind the legendary Hunka Bunka bus, which transported hundreds, if not thousands, of Disco Biscuits fans back and forth to and from the Starland Ballroom in Sayreville, New Jersey. On March 14th and 15th, the Disco Biscuits returned to the Starland for the final shows of the 2025 Bubble Tour and the last shows on the schedule for quite some time for the band. And in anticipation of these shows, we have been taking a look back at the band's storied history at the Starland. 18 shows spanning 2004 to 2012. So many legendary musical moments and so many crazy adventures that you, the Disco Biscuits fan base, have had while attending shows at the Starland. So part 1 of the miniseries, Dan Berkowitz. Part 3 of the miniseries, coming this week, Plan C archivist John Goldberg walking us through the top musical moments of the band's 18 performances at the Starland between 2004 and 2012. But today, in this second part of the Jernee Mill Road Back to Sayreville, I'm going to share with you a brief conversation I had with the man who is in large part responsible for bringing the Biscuits back to the Starland. It's no mere coincidence that this first guest has had a long storied history with the Disco Biscuits going back to the mid-1990s and the band's formative years. Jake Szufnarowski is a rock star, adventurer, podcaster, author, mental health advocate, music industry icon, and my best friend.
Oh, wow. I love how you saved the most important part for the last, Maxwell Dawson.
He's also the talent buyer for the Starland Ballroom, and therefore he is the man who is responsible for bringing the Disco Biscuits back to Slayerville. Jake's history with the Disco Biscuits goes back to the beginning, and he's been involved in many of the band's most legendary performances. If nothing else, you might remember him from this very poignant and tasteful introduction of the band on September 2nd, 2001.
So my mom was supposed to be here to introduce the band like she did in Lowell, but she's busy f***ing Max Dawson. I'm sorry I had to be here instead. So who's ready for some rock and fucking roll? Ladies and gentlemen, the last time you're ever going to hear this from me at the Wetlands, the Disco Biscuits!
I met him way back when he was the talent buyer for a club called the Wetlands Preserve, but his biography has many, many more impressive, exciting, interesting, scary, thrilling chapters. Jake, welcome to Touchdowns All Day.
It is so wonderful to be here. I've been spiking balls all morning, getting ready for one of these touchdowns.
If there's one thing I know about you, it's that you are really good at handling balls.
Yeah.
So, Jake, on a recent episode of the podcast, I filled BARBER in on the fact that you were booking Sayreville now, and he recounted his first memory of encountering you at Wetlands. And in his recollection, you were a surly New York City punk guy who was not at all impressed by the Disco Biscuits. Do you remember your first exposure to the Disco Biscuits and what you thought of them?
Yeah, I mean, I thought they stunk, but I mean, and they did, because that would have been 96 or 97, and they were not a good band back then. But I think Barber's misremembering that. I doubt that I was a surly punk guy towards that band, only because I prided myself on being kind to every band that played at Wetlands, whether I thought they stunk or not. It didn't take long for the Biscuits to stop stinking, I got to say that, but even they'll admit that they were not too good in the early days. Stink would be probably too good, too mean, too surly of a term. But yeah, I think Barber's probably let later memories of me cloud his.
And I think that also, Jake, you stood in stark contrast to the typical Wetlands concert goer. You were not the typical patchouli and tie-dye hippie type. You were a punk rock guy. You were a metal guy. You were, or at least you presented as having that. I remember meeting you and being a little intimidated. Black nail polish, crazy punk rock hair, tattoos. You just looked like a scary New York City, like someone who had just gotten a fist fight with Joey Ramone or something like that.
I mean, there's a very good chance I had just gotten in a fist fight when we met, because those were different years. But it's funny that hippies always accuse me of being a punk and a metal guy, and metal and punk guys always accuse me of being a hippie. Look at me right now. My hair hasn't changed much since we met. I don't know if this is a hippie haircut or a metal haircut. It's certainly not a punk haircut. But yeah, okay. I just consider myself a rock and roller. And for all genres that would encompass. Yeah, maybe I'm not a typical Wetlands concert goer stinking of patchouli, but most Wetlands concert goers weren't stinking of patchouli. Even the ones who came to see those early Disco Biscuit shows, maybe on the Tuesday Night Dead Center shows. But in general, the Wetlands typical concert goer was completely atypical, I would say. And even at the jam band shows, they would seem to come from all walks of life. Though, admittedly, yes, there were more than a few patchwork pants wearing freak flaggers, as we might want to call them.
You and the entire Wetlands team were instrumental in giving the Biscuits their start and also fostering their evolution. So Chris Zahn, who was your precursor as the talent buyer at the Wetlands, was, I think, the first person to put them on at that club.
It was.
And then ended up becoming their manager. The Wetlands house lighting guy, Matthew Irabino, went off to be their first full-time lighting designer. And then you, when you became the talent buyer at Wetlands, you really sort of oversaw the transition of the Biscuits from being just one of the jam bands who played there to being in that top tier in terms of booking them for big nights, putting them as the headliners for really cool lineups that had, the shows going on upstairs. You had the lounge popping off. You were bringing in new bands and exposing us all to really exciting new sounds, using the Biscuits to kind of launch other baby bands. What did you see in the Biscuits that made you believe in them after that period, of course, during which they were not so good?
It was watching their evolution from being stinkers to champions. But just watching the evolution of their sound, they weren't much different than Fish when they were starting out, which I don't think is a diss. Anybody who's heard their early stuff, and Brownstein will say that, I'm sure he has plenty of times. I would assume Barber is a big Fish fan too. I don't think we've ever spoken about it, but you can't play that kind of music and not be in a Fish. But once they started incorporating their electronic elements and the more dance elements, which didn't happen overnight, but once I started feeling that type of thing, I was like, all right, this is cool. And at that time, I was also listening to a lot of drum and bass, and I was part of the Concrete Jungle drum and bass party that had started at Wetlands, and then we moved it to Coney Island High, a big punk club where Joey Ramone hung out a lot, oddly enough. But I was deep in that world as well during that time, and when I saw that a cool jam band was incorporating those elements, I was like, I remember telling someone in maybe 99, a friend was like, who's the next huge jam band going to be that could be as big as Fish? And I was like, oh, absolutely, easily the Disco Biscuits. And I was like, it's not going to happen next year or the year after. But if they play their cards right, so to speak, I was like, they can be massive. And I don't know how massive they became popularity-wise, but they certainly spurred on a lot of those other bands. And the bands you're talking about that I championed, probably, we're talking about like The New Deal, Lake Trout, Sound Tribe, Sector 9. Those are the ones that are coming to mind, but there were plenty of other bands at that time kind of doing, like, incorporating that kind of stuff into their sound. And yeah, I would put a lot of them together, and I sort of championed and elevated the Biscuits, but then used the space that I created at the bottom of the bill by elevating the Biscuits to trying to elevate a lot more of that type of music. And it worked. And that was in my almost 30 years of being a concert promoter and booker in New York City. That was by far my favorite time, because that was a time when you could sort of build the bills yourself. Whereas nowadays, everybody, the bands and their management and agencies are very careful as to who the bands play with. So there's a lot less creative packaging and combinations that you can do as a talent buyer. Nowadays, a talent buyer is just like sending bands offers for a lot of money and trying to impress their managers. And of course, having relationships with them and stuff like, and of course, BARBER didn't know that I was the talent buyer at the Starland. You said that you had told him, which tracks completely, because I've seen BARBER plenty over the years, but the last thing I would ever talk to him about is business, or like where I would think would be the right place for the band to play. But like when I took this job a little over 2 years ago, Brownstein was one of the first calls I made. And he's like, of course we'll come back to Sayreville if the Sof is there. And Brownstein kept telling me we would. And we did it. And I am very excited to have booked my first Disco Biscuit shows. And Jesus, I don't think I ever booked a Biscuit show after Wetlands closed. In fact, I didn't. I booked some of the side project stuff, a lot of different side project stuff, but never an actual Disco Biscuit show. And all I can say now is that I'm very excited to be doing it, and very excited to be doing it with somebody else's money.
If you've ever seen a cool show or been to a cool lineup in the city over the last 30-ish years and wondered who ever thought to put together this band and that band, and well, odds are Jake maybe was behind it. So, Jake, when did you come on board at the Starland?
January 4th, 2023. So, yeah, a little over 2 years ago.
The Starland is obviously a legendary site for the Disco Biscuits, but from my understanding, it also has a kind of legendary role in New Jersey musical history. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the Starland Ballroom?
Oh, for sure. The Starland the history dates back to the early 60s when it was built and called the Jernee Mill Inn. And it had bands play. No one's really sure if any notable bands played back in those days, but probably not, because almost every band that was playing back in the 60s and early 70s were cover bands. And then throughout the 70s, I honestly couldn't tell you if there were any super notable bands that played there then, just because I think a lot of that stuff has just been lost to history. I've asked around and no one seems to really know. I may not have asked the right exact person, so I don't want to say that nobody knows, but I am a bit of a rock and roll historian myself and have asked a lot of people. And the closest anyone can sort of recount to me is that in the 80s, well, let's go back a minute. The Jernee Mill Inn throughout the mid to late 70s hosted a Wednesday night polka night with Jimmy Sturr, who is the king of polka and has I'm not even kidding, something like 50 Grammys for polka. I think that's mostly because not a lot of people were putting out polka albums, and Grammy voters just vote for the name they've heard of for a lot of those subcategories. But yeah. Jimmy Sturr was a big deal and played a weekly thing there in the 70s. But really, it was the 80s. For a little while, it got changed to Modern Times, which we knew a little bit about, sort of we, meaning the collective crew at the Starland. But Sean, our general manager, one day somewhat recently was going through, there's this old railroad car in the back of the venue that I'll get to in a minute that was used as sort of storage. And he started pulling out all these old gold records. And we knew that the Starland had a brief period where it was called Modern Times, but he found all these old gold records like Tina Turner, Phil Collins, Prince, David Bowie, just like an incredible the Police, like an incredible cross section of like hit pop from the day, and all these gold records were presented to the Starland Ballroom on behalf of these artists. So we would, or to the Modern Times venue. So we would assume that those bands played in the venue, but we can't say for sure. I did Google it a little this morning. But I didn't get too far down that rabbit hole before we had to do this call. Anyway, after that, it became a place called Willie's or Boxcar Willie's, and that's where the train car came from, and it's currently behind the venue, but it was parked out in the front in the parking lot for years. The owner bought this thing and had it shipped, and to this day, if the sun's shining the right way on it and you're standing at the right angle, you can see the outline where it says Willie's on it. But then after that, it became the Hunka Bunka Ballroom and turned into a dance club for the 80s and 90s until that closed in the early 2000s, and then it was purchased by a couple of other New Jersey legends named Tony and Jerry. Not Tom and Jerry, but Tony and Jerry. And they had run the Birch Hill nightclub, which was in Jersey, another big kind of famous music venue. And then they bought the Starland Ballroom. They ran it from 2003 to 2007. They had David Lee Roth play the opening. He was the first artist to ever play there. And then Guster was the second. So it sort of had the hard rock and jam band thing going since the jump. And then AEG, which is the parent company of Bowery Presents, the people I work for now, took it over in 2007, and it continued its shining legacy to this day. And I used to go to a lot of shows there when it first opened. My girlfriend in New York City, who you remember, Mary was her name, she had a car. And that was a huge luxury to have in New York. And so I went to a lot of shows at the Starland Ballroom. And then I sort of got a call out of the blue if I want to be the talent buyer coming out of the pandemic. And I was like, fuck yeah. Only if I could book the Disco Biscuits. They are a band that came up when I had my interview to get the job. Interview was a interesting thing to call it because I just got a phone call and I got offered the job. But then I went for a lunch to ask a lot of questions, but one was, why are there no more jam bands playing at Starland? What happened? And my bosses told me that just whoever was doing the talent buying kind of fell away from that and stopped booking jam bands. So I was like, well, I want to book more jam bands. So we did. We've had a couple of great shows with Humphreys. Now we've got the Biscuits coming up, and I can't wait.
I've heard from a lot of people that they saw heavy metal shows at the Starland back in their youth. Jersey, of course, has strong metal history, both of the hair variety and of the harder core varieties. Is there an association between the Starland and the Jersey metal scene, or is that just something?
Yeah. John Bon Jovi and Richie Sambora apparently met each other in the 80s there. I think when it was Willie's or Hunka Bunka Ballroom, and John Bon Jovi went to Sayreville High School. Richie Sambora was from South Amboy, which is just, a couple of clicks down the road. So there's a lot of history with them there. And also when Metallica first came east in the 80s, they run Megaforce Records, which was owned by Johnny and Marcia Zazula, who also started, what was it called, Hydrophonic Recordings, because they saw the jam band scene kind of coming too. And they ended up putting out the Biscuits' first album, I believe, was that Uncivilized Area or Encephalous Crime, or maybe both. That's funny enough. I wasn't expecting to talk about this. I hadn't really thought about it, but yeah, Biscuits actually have a connection to that metal scene too, but more so with Johnny and Marcia Zazula, who both unfortunately passed away during the pandemic. They had a label called Megaforce Records, which was a metal label, and they put out the first two Metallica albums, Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning. And when they passed away during the pandemic, Metallica did a show down in Florida, where they had retired to, that I went to. It was in a 7,000 seat theater at the Hard Rock Hotel, the one with the big guitar outside, where they only played the songs from those first two albums. And then Metallica would come out and play like 3 songs, 4 songs, and then they'd leave the stage and videos of Johnny and Marcia would come on the screen, and it was very cool. But yeah, when the when Metallica first came east, they played at the club too, and their whole in the early 80s, probably when it was called Modern Times. And on the first two albums, Metallica albums, they thanked the Old Bridge Militia. Old Bridge is the next town over from Sayreville, and the Old Bridge Militia was a group of metalhead fans who would frequent what is now known as the Starland Ballroom. So there was a lot of connections with the metal scene and just the rock scene in general. Bruce Springsteen's clip played at the Starland. I saw him there once. I went to an Against Me show in maybe 2006 or 7. I took the whole Rocks Off team to Great Adventure one day, and Against Me was playing, and we went. I got us like 10 tickets, and we went to see them at the Starland that night. And Bruce Springsteen, I still, when I walk into Starland now, I still remember the exact spot where Bruce Springsteen was standing by the bar. And of course, I never said anything to him, but he was just there watching the show. And then I came to find out that it was that he had taken his kid. And his kid was in a younger punk bands. Because I was like, why is Bruce Springsteen at an Against Me show?
Wow.
Yeah.
The Starland has always seemed to bring something out of the Disco Biscuits and their fans. So legendary performances and legendarily enthusiastic crowds. Any hypothesis about what it is about this venue or this location that produces such intensity?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think one of the reasons I agreed to go work for the Starland at the Starland was I loved the fact that it's wider than it is deep, and it's covered with wood. There's tons of wood inside the venue, and it felt to me like if Wetlands was 4 times its size, it would have been a lot like the Starland Ballroom. And when venues are wider than they are deep, there's a real opportunity to get up close and personal to the band, as opposed to when a venue is just long. Because, the further away you get from the stage, that's simple physics. But, like when it's just one line back, every person is further and further away. But at the Starland, you can be on both sides of the stage and all the way across the front. So the furthest person away from the stage is way closer than the furthest person would be in your typical 2,000 capacity club. So I think it's the fact that there's a ton of wood in the room that gives it a homey feel. Wood, as anyone who's ever been around much audio knows, that wood really soaks up sound in a wonderful way and reflects it in a much warmer way than concrete and steel would, which is what a lot of venues are made out of now. And also, like, the sight lines are way better, so you just feel like you're more of a part of the performance. And on top of that, if you haven't been to the Starland before, then getting there sort of makes you feel like you're at the beginning of an episode of Law and Order, because there's these 2 major roads on either side of the Starland, but they're each 1.5 miles away. So there's one road that connects those other 2. When I say major roads, they're just, they're not really major roads. They're not highways or anything, but there's this one road that's about 3 miles long called the Jernee Mill Road. And right smack dab in the middle of that is the Starland Ballroom. And whichever side you come into Jernee Mill Road from, you're passing through just basically trucking warehouses. And then you get right to the center. And on one side of the road is the VFW hall, where you can go get cheap drinks before the Biscuits play. I shouldn't say that, but they sell very cheap drinks, but they also, their parking lot becomes our parking lot. So a lot of people park over there. There's a tank in front of the VFW hall. And then there's the Starland on the other side of the road that's surrounded on 3 sides by a junkyard and 1 side by a swamp. So you really get the sense that you're in the middle of nowhere, and you sort of get the sense that anything fucking goes once you're inside. And that's obviously not the truth, especially it might have been a lot more the truth in the early 2000s when Tony and Jerry owned the place. And by all accounts, it was. Like, it was literally anything goes back then. And then AEG bought it, and things like insurance and attorneys became part of the equation. So people had to enforce the rules a little bit more. And these days, of course, rules are enforced, but also there's a lot less to worry about enforcing in 2025 than there was in 2005, because people just don't take the amount and kinds of drugs that we did back then, and they don't act with as much wanton abandon as they did back then. I'm not to say it doesn't happen, but there were a lot of biscuit shows back in the day. I remember this one time we went to see them at the Silo in Reading, Pennsylvania. They did a 2-night stand at the Silo. You were there, and I was pretty high on acid after the show and sitting in my bed in the hotel that was like across the parking lot from the Silo. And I saw a guy ride down the hotel hallway on a unicycle. And then I was like, there's no way that happened, right? I'm just tripping. And then I ran out into the hallway, and yeah, he was there. And I don't think that's going to happen. And that the old bridge, Hampton Inn, on the night of March 14th, I would love it if it did. I would really love it. And I would hope.
I feel like now you've thrown down the challenge. If you are a unicyclist who is listening to Touchdowns all day, please get in touch, and we'll see you in the hallway at the Hampton Inn.
I'll tell you what, first guy to roll up to the Starland Ballroom and enter the parking lot and make it all the way to the front door on a unicycle, I'll give you a free ticket.
Love it. All right. So, Jake, in the 13 years since the Disco Biscuits have last played at the Starland, I understand the venue has undergone some renovations and some updating. What has changed at the Starland since back then for Biscuits fans who remember those shows from 2004 through 2012? What can they expect coming back to the Starland now in 2025?
And one of the things I love about it so much is that almost nothing has changed. And that's the building got flooded during Hurricane Sandy because the Raritan River flows behind the junkyard and feeds that swamp I was talking about. A swamp where a Biscuits fan once ran into because security caught him selling drugs and took him outside, and he thought they were going to call the police. And apparently he ran into the swamp and hid in there. And then our security... I wasn't working there at the time, but the Royal Hour security apparently got really freaked out because it was the winter time and they thought he was going to freeze to death, but they ended up finding him. And
thank God.
But when it got flooded, it was rebuilt pretty much to be exactly as it was. They just had to rip a lot of rotten and moldy wood out and re-put it in. But the one major thing that changed is the tile in the woman's room. And the women's room can be, if you're looking at the stage of Starland, there's a men's room to the right and a men's room to the left. And then there's a women's room to the right and left. But that women's room connects behind the stage, which is a pretty cool feature. So if you're a woman and you know that your friends are on one side of the venue and you're on the other, and it's too crowded to make your way through the crowd, you can go through the bathroom. But the tiles in there are like these cool sparkly tiles. They're very like Housewives of New Jersey. Real Housewives of New Jersey type of tacky, but they work so well in this venue, and people love putting Instagram selfies and stuff on Instagram of the tiles of the bathroom. But otherwise, not much has changed. When you pull into the parking lot, it still looks the same. The sound has been upgraded, the lighting's been upgraded. But one of the reasons I was excited to go work there is because it sort of feels like a time warp in the best of ways. In that it feels like a really old school historic venue. You can feel it when you're in there, and I'm sure a lot of people who go to a lot of shows, you go to these newer venues like, say Brooklyn Steel, fucking incredible venue. Biscuits did 2 nights there recently, but 6 months before that, they played Webster Hall, which had been around as operating as a venue since the 1920s. And you can feel the history when you walk into Webster Hall. You walk into Brooklyn Steel and you're like, this is a fucking great venue, but you also understand that this was probably built sometime in the last 10 or 15 years. But at Starland, you walk in there and you're like, this place is fucking old. Like, it's old in the good ways. It doesn't feel like it's about to fall down in any way. Like it's a very nice structure, but it sort of breathes history. Yeah, and I'm excited for Biscuits fans to come back and experience it again, because I don't think the Biscuits play a lot of these types of venues anymore. I like to call it America's premier rock and roll roadhouse. And I know that's a lie, because Kane's Ballroom in Tulsa is really America's premier rock and roll roadhouse, but I don't think their talent buyer puts that in his fucking email signature.
Well, I think that the Biscuits always play their best in the grimiest of venues, the venues with the most character, history, When I hear next to a junkyard and a swamp, I think that's, put it next to a strip club, a plasma center, and a freeway underpass, and the Biscuits are going to play the best concert of your life at that venue. So the fact that Starland has that history, not only with the Biscuits, but going back to decades, it is the ideal spot for the Biscuits to close out this bubble tour. So, Jake, we are all very, very excited for this. Thank you for making this happen. When they announced that the Biscuits would be returning to Slayerville, the response from the fans was electric. So many people associate this venue with their, it's for a lot of people, I think, what I think the Wetlands was. It was the place where you were experiencing something so powerful, so intense. All your friends were there. You were the right age. It was the right place, the right time. So for an entire generation of Biscuits fans, the Starland is their mecca. And they think about and tell the stories of those shows still to this day as if they're some of their warmest and fondest memories of not only the band, but also of their own, coming of age and youth. And so for the band to come back here full circle after all this time, and not only that, but to be doing it with you is a very, very exciting and fitting culmination to a very long story.
Yeah, I'm excited too, man. And not only just because I got to book this show, but I'm excited because the Biscuits are playing arguably better than they've played maybe in their whole career. I've been to a bunch of shows in the last few years. I've listened to some of the recordings. I love that you hit me to a lot of it and send me and say, hey, this is a fucking great version of this. And I check that stuff out, obviously. And so I'm really excited that the Biscuits are not only coming back to play, but that I think I would assume in their own way, they're coming back to say, we should have never been away. This is Starland. We're the fucking Disco Biscuits. We're better than ever. And we're going to show you guys, that we nasty, but we good.
Jake, last question before I let you go. What is Truckin'?
Truckin' is my newish band where our tagline is we're dead, but we rip. And we play Grateful Dead songs in a hard rockin' and heavy metal style. Because like I said, to bring this all full circle, the punks think I'm a hippie and the hippies think I'm a punk. So I was like, well, I'm just going to show you how I actually do embody, both of those monikers or sort of genres. And come see Truckin' sometime. I go by the name Pink Pen, and I'm the lead singer.
And we have, on a recent episode of Touchdowns All Day, shared a little bit of audio of Jake. I think it was performing Turn On Your Love Light in a style that, let's just say, Jerry was doing pirouettes in his grave in the best possible way. I think Jake really embodies the spirit of Pigpen in terms of the highly suggestive interludes and raps. And if you guys love the Dead and are like me, kind of tired of the same old Dead tribute bands trying to play note perfect renditions, and you want to hear that repertoire reinterpreted in a completely new style, you gotta check out Truckin'. The Touch of Grey cover alone is worth the price of admission.
Thank you, Max. Thank you.
Well, Jake, can't wait for these shows to go down and can't wait to do a full episode with you, because we're only scratching the surface here, not only about your history with the Disco Biscuits, but just you. Most interesting person I know, and stories that you have about your life in and out of the music industry that I think warrant their own full episode of Touchdowns All Day. So please promise me you'll come back soon.
It would be my pleasure and my honor, Max.
That's where we'll leave it. Touchdowns All Day is an Osiris Media production. Check us out on the web at www.touchdownsallday.com. This episode was written, produced, and edited by me, Max Dawson, and was mixed and mastered by Matt Dwyer. Barber and I would love to hear from you. 424-666-SIYD. Just because the Jernee Mill Road to Sayreville miniseries is behind us doesn't mean you can't call in with your favorite Sayreville stories or stories from any venue, any era from the band's history. John is at Barber Shreds and I'm at FY Maxwell on all social platforms. You can hit us on the show account at TDADBaby on X and at Touchdowns All Day on Instagram. This and every episode of Touchdowns All Day, especially this episode, would not be possible without the contributions of many people, including the Disco Biscuits road crew: Ben, Pat, Nick, Brian, Rich, Dane, Amin, Herm, and Tara. The band itself: Mark, John, Aaron, Alan, and the professor, Dr. Samuel Altman. Ben Baruch and Andrew Kaplan at 1111 Management. The Touchdowns All Day Advisory Committee was clutch in the production of this and the last episode on Sayreville. Special thanks to Andy Bazzani and Mike Walsh, Russ Tabes, Dave Cook, Scott McClintock, Rich Steele, Ian Armstrong, John Goldberg, John Polides, Colin Stern, and Ryan Ryonix. And as I do every episode, I'd like to thank our coaches, Joey and Steve. And last but not least, my partner, Avery. Love you, babe. On behalf of John Barber and the entire Touchdowns All Day family, this is Max Dawson saying see you next time.
We're mass communicating. We're mass communicating. Mass communicating.
Osiris.